Hello dear friends, I hope you're doing well. How can we link two sentences that express contrastive or opposite ideas or opinions? What is the difference between although, though, even if, and even though, and however, nevertheless on the one hand, and how do these differ from in spite of, despite, and notwithstanding? What is the accurate punctuation for the members of each group? We will try to answer these questions with illustrations, and the message here is not to teach these words because I assume that they are known. The message is that wrong punctuation and wrong use of these linking words can lead to poor quality of language use. Mistakes related to these linking words are so recurrent that something needs to be said about them. Before the contents of the video unfold, this is a call on you to hit the like button and to comment on the videos, of course, if you find the content of interest. Now let's start our discussion with the following simple and straightforward example. He is so poor, he bought a very expensive car. Obviously, we do not expect someone who is so poor to buy an expensive car. There might be other reasons like coming into a fortune, we don't know, but common sense has it that someone who is so poor, or he is poor, cannot afford a very expensive car. Therefore, the relation between the first and the second sentence is a relation of contrast. They are like opposites. Obviously, one very easy way of linking these two is by using but. We will not talk about this because it's so frequent and it's so known. We will consider other alternatives that can be exploited in academic English. Let's start with the word although. So what happens when we use although? There are two conditions that we need to talk about for although to link two contrastive ideas. First and foremost, after although we need to have a subject and a verb for the first part, and then comma, and then subject verb. Although he was poor, although he is poor, comma, he bought a car, for example, an expensive car. So we have subject verb in the first part and subject verb in the second part. The second important point to bear in mind is that we use although and then the first part of the clause and then we put a comma. A comma here is necessary. Although he was poor, comma, he bought an expensive car. Even if he was poor, comma, he bought an expensive car. Even though and though, they have the same structure, same punctuation, they have the same meaning. They are sisters. They are sisters because you might choose to take one and replace it with the other. They are sisters because they are doing the same thing. It's like they belong to the same family. No difference whatsoever. There is a possibility for moving although and its sisters to the middle of the sentence. So we can either say, although he was so poor, he bought an expensive car, or he bought an expensive car although he was so poor. The only difference here is that when you put although at the beginning, we definitely need a comma after the first clause. Although he was poor, comma, he bought an expensive car. He bought an expensive car, although he was poor. We don't need any comma here. The assumption is that the place of the comma is taken by although itself. And now let's move to the second group of linking words that can join two sentences that express contrast. This has to do with however and nevertheless. In an earlier short video, I made the point that there is a nuance between however and nevertheless, and I said in regard to this that however is generally used by careful users of the language when we move from something that is positive and we end up with something negative. Still, many users of the English language, can make the point that whether you use nevertheless or however, that does not matter. It's not a mistake. It's just it just has to do with careful use of the English language. Whatever the case, for although and its sisters, we have although, subject, verb, something, then comma, and then you continue the other clause that starts with a subject and a verb. For however, the story is different. For however, we need to write the first sentence and then insert however or nevertheless, and then put a comma and then continue. But when we do this, we definitely need to mark the ending of the first sentence. He was so poor, full stop. Nevertheless, comma, he bought an expensive car. That's the only way we can do it here. We cannot write a comma and then however or nevertheless. He was so rich, full stop. However, comma, he could not buy a car, let alone an expensive car. So the point I am making here is that when we use however and nevertheless, we definitely need to be careful, with the full stop that needs to mark the ending of the first part. He was so rich, full stop, however, and then you comma, and then you continue, or nevertheless. So however and nevertheless have to have this form, this shape. They have to take this punctuations, full stop, and then we continue. I strongly believe that this mistake is again as a transfer from the French language. In French we have néanmoins, cependant, pourtant. In French there is no restriction in regard to punctuation. So comma, the comma will suffice. No need for the full stop in French. In fact, if you write a full stop, people might judge you, judge this as inaccurate. In French, it's the comma is the default punctuation before that. For example, il veut rejoindre sa famille à Paris, cependant, il n'a pas eu son passeport. When you write a sentence like this in French, then if you put a comma before cependant, there is no problem. This is probably transferred into English by so many students. Same thing for néanmoins, pourtant, etc. This is just between brackets. English is a language that necessitates this full stop before, however, and nevertheless. Some students say, well, sir, we have found a case where however is used between two commas. Yes, you can find this, but not that after immediately after the first clause has ended. Stylistically, I can say something like, he is so poor, he bought an expensive car, comma, however. So it's just a displacement of however from one position into another within the same clause, no problem. But even if we do this, we need to have a full stop after the first clause. A second example can be, she made the point that she had consistently high grades in all her courses. Full stop. This, however, did not surprise me. This, comma, however, comma, did not surprise me. This is just a difference of style. But this should not be an argument that, however, can come between two commas, because what we mean by a comma is the comma that starts the clause. Because if you write, the canonical position of however is immediately after the first clause has finished, and then we choose whether to displace it or not. So when the first clause finishes, comma, and you write a comma and you write however, that's a serious mistake. The third type of linking words that express this link between two opposing or contrastive sentences are in spite of, despite, and notwithstanding. In spite of and the remaining two sisters are interchangeable. That is to say, you can take one, put the other one in all contexts. There is no problem with that. Now, what is the difference between this and although? In spite of generally takes a noun phrase, not a subject and a verb. We need to nominalize, we need to produce a noun. An example, although he was poor. In spite of he was poor, that's a mistake. When I say in spite of, I shouldn't have a subject verb for the first clause. I should nominalize. In spite of his poverty. He was rich despite his richness. Despite he is rich does not hold water. Despite he is not rich is a mistake. Despite he is not rich is a mistake. So, despite his richness, comma, he could not afford or he did not buy a car, let alone an expensive car. In spite of his poverty, he bought an expensive car. Notwithstanding his poverty, he bought an expensive car. We cannot say notwithstanding he was poor. No, although he was poor, yes. What separates the although sisters from the in spite of sisters is just what they take with them. It's just the form that follows. Although subject verb, in spite of a noun phrase. One further note, please. For despite, in spite of, and notwithstanding, It can take a noun, but if we fail, for example, for one reason or another, we want to use this, but we cannot nominalize, we cannot find a noun. What we might choose to do is either to write the ing in some contexts, despite being so poor, that can go, despite being so poor, certainly not despite he is being so poor, no, despite being, you take the verb and you put it in the ing and then you go. Despite being so poor, despite being rich, or his being rich, just to adorn it further. Or we can use the fact that. If we are keen on subject verb, comma, subject verb, like although, with despite and in spite of and notwithstanding, we need the fact that. Let me go back to the first example. Although he was poor, it's fine. In spite of he is poor is not fine. What is fine is in spite of the fact that he was poor. So the fact that here solves the problem. Although he was rich, he did not buy a car. In spite of his richness, he did not buy the car. In spite of being rich, he did not buy the car. In spite of the fact that he was rich, he did not buy the car. Certainly, in spite of, or despite, or notwithstanding, he is rich, this is not possible. Finally, I would like to call on you to use punctuation very carefully, because mispunctuating the sentences, not putting real boundaries between sentences in the form of full stops or semicolons, can end up in run-on sentences, and these are signs of poor quality, especially in academic writing. With this, I bring this video to a close.